in Boston shook this nation and brought back memories of that day in September 2001 that changed our lives forever. I'm confident that we will emerge from this tragedy stronger than ever before. Anyone who thinks they can execute an attack on this country and change our way of life greatly underestimates our spirit and our resolve. It is the responsibility of this committee to provide oversight and investigate what happened, what went wrong, and what we can do to better protect American lives. The victims and their families deserve no less. We will never forget April the 15th, but we must do more than remember. We must hold accountable those who did us harm, as well as the terrorists who inspired them. We must also demand more than just answers for any mistakes that were made. We must find solutions so that it does not happen again. In the chaos following the blast, the American people, including myself, were amazed at the courage of first responders and civilians who ran towards the explosion instead of running away. These men and women motivate us all to pick up the pieces and to move forward. Commissioner, we're so honored and proud to have you here today. We applaud you, as well as the first responders and law enforcement officers who risk their lives to save others. And we owe all of you a debt of gratitude. In order to move forward, today we look back. The families who lost loved ones and the over 260 wounded deserve answers about how this happened and what can be improved in the future. Almost 3 weeks after the smoke cleared on Boylston Street, many questions remain. What we know today is that radical Islamists still threaten our homeland. And while we don't know if this attack was foreign directed, we certainly know it was foreign inspired. Tamerlan Tsarnaev's trip to the Chechen region, the radical videos proclaiming the caliphate that he posted when he returned, and the types of bombs that he and his younger brother used all signal an al-Qaeda-inspired terrorist attack. And while mystery continues to surround what happened on the older brother's trip to Dagestan, much can be drawn from what we know about the region. Many Chechen rebels have forged a bond with the al-Qaeda jihadist movement. These lethal warriors have fought side by side with al-Qaeda and the Taliban against U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. In fact, my constituent's son, Marine Sergeant Byron Norwood, was killed by 9 Chechen rebels in Iraq. Perhaps most appalling are the suspect's reported statements following his capture. These men who hate our values used our freedoms to kill Americans. Since the bombing, questions have been raised about whether the dots were connected before and after the attack. We know that Russian intelligence warned the FBI about Tamerlan and that he may travel outside the United States to meet with extremists. We know he was then investigated and interviewed by the FBI. But when he traveled to the Chechen region in 2012, the FBI was unaware. The CIA also received an alert from Russian intelligence, and the agency asked that he be added to a terror watch list. We now know that DHS was alerted to his trip overseas, but nothing was done. In other words, he was on our radar screen, and then he was off. What remains unanswered is whether this information was shared between federal agencies and state and local officials. Almost 9 months after Tamerlan returned, he and his brother, Dzhokhar, executed the largest terrorist attack on our soil since 9/11. This demonstrates that the radical jihad movement is alive and well around the world and in the homelands. We learned over a decade ago the danger in failing to connect the dots. The cornerstone of the 9/11 Commission report was that agencies had stovepiped intelligence, which prevented us from seeing potential terrorist plots. In fact, the DHS was created in the wake of 9/11 to help fix this problem. My fear is that the Boston bombers may have succeeded because our system failed. We can and we must do better. Equally concerning is the emerging narrative which downplays the spread of the global jihadist movement. From the attack at Fort Hood to the tragedy at Benghazi, the Boston bombings are our most recent reminder that we must call terrorism really for what it is in order to confront it. You cannot defeat an enemy you refuse to acknowledge. I was disturbed in the days following the attack to read that some officials had closed the case on whether there was a foreign connection, when the FBI had just begun its investigation. As a former federal counterterrorism prosecutor, this rush to judgment, in my view, was premature and irresponsible. The American people demand and deserve accountability. And while we investigate what may have gone wrong, we must also pay tribute to what went right. Just as tragedy often exposes weaknesses, it also reveals our character. The acts of heroism in Boston in the minutes and days after the attack made us all proud to be Americans. And with that, the chair now recognizes the ranking minority member, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding today's hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses for appearing. This hearing has been billed as a first look at Boston Marathon bombing. While it's appropriate that we examine the events of April 15th, we need to understand and recognize our limitations. First, we must recognize that the events of the day remain under investigation. While we must fulfill our oversight responsibilities under the Constitution, we must be careful not to jeopardize an ongoing criminal investigation. So we must exercise some discretion in our questioning and our statements about these events, the suspects and theories about links to others who may have not been in custody. Despite these limitations, there's such much that we can discuss regarding the Boston Marathon bombing. We can and should discuss the incredible response from the police, firefighters, and emergency medical personnel. Once again, the first responder community ran toward a catastrophic situation when others were running away. So I want to commend the Boston first responders for their bravery and heroic actions. But I also must recognize that as first responders, they demonstrate that kind of bravery every day. Second, we need to acknowledge the people of Boston and the surrounding area. They not only responded with calm and determination on that day, but in the days that followed, they responded to law enforcement's call for help by sharing their photographs and videos. That kind of community spirit, the willingness to pull together and lend a hand, is one of the qualities that make this country a great place. Additionally, we must recognize the thoughtful and difficult decision by the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, requiring residents to remain in their homes for a few days after the bombing, and placing an entire city on lockdown was not easy. But given that the exact nature of the threat was unknown, it was a decision which had to be made. And finally, we must acknowledge the decision of the Attorney General to immediately refer to the bombing as an act of terror and send the FBI and other federal law enforcement to assist in the effort to locate, arrest, and bring to justice those responsible. Mr. Chairman, as we look at the events of April 15th and the days that followed, we must also look at what happened before April 15th. As a Committee on Homeland Security, we must acknowledge that the kind of response that occurred on that day would not have been possible without federal grant funds. The effectiveness of the response executed by the first responders is a direct result of over a decade of investment in preparedness and response capabilities and exercises supported by the Federal Emergency Management Agency and its targeted Homeland Security grants. Since 2002, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Boston urban area have received over $1.3 billion in funding through federal grant programs. The Commonwealth and the Boston urban area have used these funds to develop the capabilities to prevent, prepare for, mitigate the effect of, respond to, and recover from natural disasters and terrorist attacks like the Boston Marathon bombing. Anyone who has doubts about the value of federal grant dollars should be reminded of the brave actions of the first responders on April 15th. So as this Congress continues to cut funding for these programs, I hope my colleagues on the other side, who are members of the committee, will oppose these cuts. Refusal to support these funding cuts will be the greatest tribute any of us could make to the people of the Boston area. But Mr. Chairman, I also recognize that in addition to the positive effects of federal grant funding, the Boston bombing also reveals some negatives that we cannot ignore. We cannot ignore that once again, it has taken a tragedy to reveal problems in our vast, varied, and numerous federal databases. We faced a similar problem of a faulty database in the Christmas Day bombing incident. Now we learn that there were database problems which made it possible for one of the bombing suspects to re-enter the country after a trip to Russia. It's time to recognize that we must develop a way to fix and integrate the various databases. We must also realize that in the federal government, no one agency or entity has the responsibility and the authority to scrub and integrate these vast systems that contain records on millions of people. Congress cannot continue to complain about the failure of the databases without giving the authority and the funding to one agency to fix these problems. I guarantee you that if we fail to act, we will be discussing this issue again. But that is not the only issue we must act upon. Mr. Chairman, in response to the events of September 11, Congress enacted the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act of 2002. That measure increased the availability of terrorism risk insurance at-risk American businesses by guaranteeing that the government would share some of the losses with private insurers should a terrorist attack occur. That act is set to sunset in 2014. Today, I'm introducing a bill that would not only extend the act, but would add some needed improvements. I urge my colleagues on this committee to co-sponsor this act. We must recognize that small businesses and others that suffer an economic loss due to a terrorist act should not have to shoulder the burden alone and should not have to rely on the kindness of charity. Finally, Mr. Chairman, as we take the first look at the Boston bombing, I hope we do not fall into a pattern of reaching conclusions before all the facts are known. At this point in the investigation, speculation about the motivations of the suspects and the role of external influences seem to change daily. We all want to know the answers and are tempted to reach our own conclusions. But everyone and everywhere I read that everything there is a time and season. This is not the time, and the season had not yet come. But it will arrive shortly. So I look forward to our second look, Mr. Chairman, where we can receive testimony from representatives of the intelligence and investigative agencies that may serve to answer many of our questions about motivations, the suspect, and external influences. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Let me just say, as a former federal prosecutor, I always reserve judgment until all the evidence is in on the case. And with respect to grant funding, I met with the Boston Fire Commissioner yesterday, who told me if it wasn't for the Department of Homeland Security grant funding that helped them with their training exercises and response exercises, it could have been a different situation, and that helped in saving, I think, many American lives. And so with that, let me just say we're pleased to have the witnesses here today on this important topic. First witness, no stranger to the Congress, our friend and colleague, Senator Joseph Lieberman. We all know represented the state of Connecticut with very distinguished in a way in the United States Senate from 1989 to 2013. In the months after September the 11th, he led the fight to create the Department of Homeland Security, which led to the creation of this committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee, which he chaired until his retirement from the Congress earlier this year. With that, I thought it would be appropriate for my fellow colleague and friend from the Boston area. He has one of the best districts probably in the country, but the Boston area, and he has also represents Watertown. And I thought it would be appropriate for him to introduce the police commissioner and Mr. Schwartz.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been in Watertown. Most of the state I have represented at one time or another, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. I just have the pleasure of introducing Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis. In 2006, Commissioner Davis was appointed by Boston Mayor Tom Menino to be the 40th Police Commissioner in the City of Boston. In this role, he oversees police services for over 500,000 people, along with all those visitors that come into the great city. Mr. Davis, I knew before he was Commissioner because of his work in Lowell. He worked with the Lowell Police Department for decades. He also was a leader in using that position to bring different layers of law enforcement and officials together, working in a task force with major cities. He was the superintendent of the office in Lowell in 1994, and during this period, he was recognized for reducing the crime rate in Lowell quicker than any other superintendent in America, with over 100,000 residents. Most recently, Mr. Davis led the police department's response to the Boston Marathon bombings on April 15th. The heroic actions and the quick thinking of the men and women under Mr. Davis's leadership, as well as the National Guard, Fire Department, first responders, and civilians and extraordinary medical community that we have in Boston, led to the survival of 17 critically injured civilians on that fateful day. I also want to note during his leadership that he kept first and foremost in his mind the 4 victims that lost their lives, Lindsay Lou, Martin Richard, Crystal Campbell, and Sean Collier. He just demonstrated extraordinary leadership, and I want to thank you for that, Commissioner, and we're pleased to have you here today. Another friend of mine, Kurt Schwartz, is the Undersecretary of the committee in Massachusetts. He's been a person who has just done extraordinary work in so many different regards. He was an EMT himself, he was a police officer himself, and he's served so many different important positions in Massachusetts at times of crisis and emergency. It's the Homeland Security Emergency Management in the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security in 2007. He was the leader. He also serves as the director of our MEMA agency, as well as the Homeland Security Advisor for Governor Patrick and the state. He's had a long history of service in the Commonwealth, and he's also been Undersecretary for Law Enforcement, Fire Services under Governor Patrick as well. Further, he's worked for 8 years under the Attorney General, where he worked with district attorneys and other law enforcement officials like myself. For the 5 years as Chief of the Criminal Bureau and the 12 years as Assistant District Attorney in Middlesex County, he again expanded a resume that's rich and deserved. This doesn't really include the full picture of Kurt Schwartz. He is a man who brought people together. Most recently, Undersecretary Schwartz played a critical role in emergency planning and response to the Boston Marathon attacks. He oversaw and participated in many of the training exercises which aided in the response so successfully on April 15th, and further managed Governor Patrick's shelter shelter-in-place order or the lockdown for the city of Boston. This aided to the successful apprehension of the suspects and also saved possible damage for their other actions that they had contemplated. I want to thank both of these gentlemen for being here. I've been proud to work with you personally, and you're to be both thanked for what you've done to save lives in this terrible tragedy that hit us in Boston. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Our final witness is Professor Errol Southers. Mr. Southers is the Associate Director of the National Homeland Security Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of the Terrorism Events at the University of Southern California. Thanks for being here today. And Mr. Southers formerly served as Deputy Director in California, the Office of Homeland Security. The witness's full statements will be made in the record. The chair now recognizes Senator Lieberman for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, thanks very much for inviting me to testify and for giving me the honor of doing so alongside Commissioner Davis, Secretary Schwartz, and Professor Struthers. As the chairman was kind enough to say, after the terrorist attacks on America on 9/11/01, I was privileged to work with colleagues in both houses, both parties, and the executive branch to enact the most comprehensive reforms of our national security system since the beginning of the Cold War in the late 1940s. And that was appropriate because we were, as a result of 9/11, entered a new phase of our security history against a very unconventional enemy. I am grateful that the reforms we adopted and the new organizations we created have worked very well to protect the American people from terrorist attacks since 9/11. But, as we saw in Boston, they are not perfect. Here's the record in brief. Since 9/11, no terrorist plot planned and launched from abroad against our homeland has succeeded. At least 65 homegrown terrorist plots have been stopped. That's a remarkable record and a tribute to the men and women, civilian and military, public and private, who have devoted their lives to keeping us safe. But the reality is that 3 terrorist attacks, all homegrown, have succeeded. Carlos Bledsoe, who killed an Army recruiter in Little Rock in 2009, Nidal Hassan, who killed 13 at Fort Hood later that same year, and now the Chernayev brothers, who killed 4 and severely wounded many more in Boston less than a month ago. The Boston attack was, in fact, the first successful terrorist attack, foreign or homegrown, on civilians, non-military personnel, in America since 9/11. Could it have been prevented and stopped? Well, from what I know of the facts in Boston, and none of us know them all at this point, and from what I've learned over the years about homegrown Islamist terrorism, I believe that though it would not have been easy, it was possible to have prevented the terrorist attacks in Boston. In a literal sense, the Homeland Security system, we must acknowledge that we built after 9/11 to protect the American people from terrorist attacks, failed to stop the Chernayev brothers. With your help, we must find out why and fix it. I remember a leader in our Homeland Security system nationally who once said to me, the terrorists can keep coming at us and they only have to succeed once. We have to stop them every time, and that's almost impossible, but that's the standard our Homeland Security defenders hold themselves to, and we have to as well. That's why I'm so grateful you've begun this investigation. I think you've got to go back step by step, pull it apart, and ask what more could the public and private individuals involved here have done to prevent this. If I may respectfully offer 4 brief points of counsel. The first is that in today's political environment, whenever there's a governmental failure, there's also the risk that the administration in power will become defensive and not share information, and that Congress will be divided by partisan politics and lose sight of its overriding mission, which of course is to protect the American people from the next planned terrorist attack. I hope and believe that this Congress and this administration will not let that happen this time. Second, the Boston Marathon attacks should again teach us that the enemy we face is violent Islamist extremism, not just Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden is dead, and the remaining leadership of Al-Qaeda is on the run, but the ideology of violent Islamist extremism is rapidly spreading. We don't know yet whether the Chernayev brothers were involved with any foreign group, but we do know that they adopted the outrageously false narrative of violent Islamist extremism, that Islam and America are involved in a struggle to the death with each other. That fact compels us to ask again how this ideology and radicalization to it can be countered and ultimately stopped. The leaders and members of the world's Muslim communities, including our own fellow Americans who are Muslim, probably have the greatest capacity to do the most important work of counter-radicalization, but the rest of us have a responsibility to help. 3, prior to 9/11, Mr. Chairman, as you've said, there was too little sharing of information about terrorist threats among government agencies, and therefore the so-called dots could not be connected because they weren't even on the same board. Our post-9/11 reforms aim to overcome that serious problem, and to a significant degree they did. In fact, today, there's so much information being shared on the same metaphorical boards by governmental agencies that the larger problem for our Homeland Security personnel may be being able to separate the wheat from the chaff, to identify the most important dots on the board so that they can be connected. And that may have been a big part of the problem in the Boston case. I urge you to try to determine whether it was, as well as to ask whether lingering failures to share information, in this case, particularly by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, made it more difficult to prevent the Boston attack. It may be that the most damaging failure to share information was committed by the Russian intelligence service, whose original inquiries to the FBI and CIA were quite vague, and apparently whose knowledge of what Tamerlan Chernayev did in Dagestan and Chechnya last year was not really conveyed to our government in any degree until after the Boston Marathon attacks. However, we've still got to ask, and I hope you will, shouldn't the fact that the first notice of Tamerlan Chernayev's possible radicalization came to us from a very uncommon source, Russian intelligence, have marked the case for special handling by our government and guaranteed that this file would not be closed? Were the original FBI interviews of Tamerlan Chernayev adequate to determine whether he was likely to radicalize to violent Islamist extremism? Was the FBI investigation curtailed by existing Attorney General guidelines on such investigations, which go back to the previous administration? Did the FBI enlist the help of state and local law enforcement, either on or off the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Boston, to continue to watch Tamerlan, engage with his friends, associates, and community leaders, and monitor his internet activities for the purpose of assessing whether he was radicalizing even further? And why didn't the Department of Homeland Security notify the FBI and the Boston JTTF when its system pinged that Tamerlan Chernayev had returned from Dagestan and Chechnya? And finally, fourth, when it comes to preventing homegrown terrorists from attacking our homeland, from attacking us, our Homeland Security agencies cannot do it alone. The government needs the help of the American people. If people see something suspicious, they must say something to our government. In this case, there were people who clearly could have prevented the massacre at the marathon by just saying something. Most obvious are the 3 friends of Dzhokhar Tamerlan that have been arrested. Certainly they should have told police what they saw and heard instead of allegedly obstructing justice. It's also true that the leaders and members of the Boston Mosque that threw Tamerlan out because of his extreme views could have said something to the police and even done something to counter his radicalization. And even members of the Chernayev family, including Tamerlan's wife, could have saved lives, including Tamerlan's, if they had said something or asked someone for help. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, the cost of silence, as we learned again on April 15th, can be enormous as the cost of not aggressively carrying out the post-mortem investigations that you in Congress and the administration have now begun. I thank you for that, and I will do anything I can to help you in this investigation, beginning with answering your questions this morning.
Well, thank you, Senator. Thank you for your service to our nation, national security issues, homeland security issues. We look forward to working with you. We always open your advice and counsel, and I think you raised some excellent questions and excellent points. The chair now recognizes Commissioner Davis, and again, let me just say that your actions and the people of Boston made us all proud to be Americans. And with that, I recognize you for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was truly a team effort. Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the tragedy that occurred in Boston on Patriots' Day, when two cowardly brothers laid siege to one of Massachusetts' most venerated traditions, the Boston Marathon. I'm here as a commissioner of the Boston Police Department, but I also speak on behalf of Mayor Thomas Menino, the Mayor's emergency management staff, and law enforcement from across the state and across the nation when I describe our cooperative response to these attacks and what they did to our community. I'd like to point to the 4 people who were killed in this attack. They are indicative of who was there at that event that day. We have 8-year-old Martin Richard, who was there with his mother and sister, and his father had just run by completing the marathon when the blast went off. We have a Boston University graduate student, Lou Lindsay. She was finishing her studies and was there with friends right next to Martin when that bomb went off. We have a restaurant manager, 29-year-old Crystal Campbell, who stood with her friends and was at the finish line when the first explosion occurred and lost her life there. And a few days later, we have Officer Sean Collier, who was sitting in his cruiser in Cambridge when these two brothers came up and assassinated him. A young man that had committed his life to law enforcement, a young man that was about to go on the Somerville Police Department. These individuals turned the city upside down. And the impact on Boston will last for years. The Boston Marathon will come back stronger next year, but it will never happen again without the memory of this tragic event. But out of that tragedy and out of that terrible experience comes an enormous amount of strength on the part of the community. It was alluded to earlier in conversations, but the medical people who staffed the tents at the end of the finish line, they were there to treat people with blisters and exhaustion, and instead they ended up being thrown into a battlefield scenario with treating injuries that were horrendous. If it wasn't for the actions of my police officers, firefighters, EMS people who responded to the scene, and those medical people from the tents that ran down the street, the death toll would be much higher. And so that kind of response is indicative of what happened in the city of Boston. I think it underlies this whole conversation about Boston Strong. And it involved the BAA, who runs the event. It involved spectators, businesses in the downtown area, especially in the Back Bay area, that were shut down for over a week because of the evidence processing that had to happen. The amount of charitable giving that occurred there, the patience that people had, was spectacular. The cities and residents of Boston, Cambridge, and Watertown cooperated with us when the mayor and the governor made the decision to shut the city down. That was the right decision to make based on the information that we had at 3 or 4 o'clock that morning, and the residents fully cooperated, which was astounding. Boston is a stronger city because of this, and I hope that the people who commit these these atrocious acts understand that there's a futility in their efforts. The city is back on its feet. We'll never forget the people that you see to my left, but I will tell you that they had no effect on the city of Boston except to make us a stronger community. One of the things that has been much discussed here is the information sharing that occurred before and after this incident. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the cooperation of the FBI, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Massachusetts State Police, and all of the help that they gave us when this happened. In the seconds after I was notified of this, the very first phone call I made was to Rick Delorier, the SAC of the FBI in Boston. Him and Tim Albin, the colonel of the state police, were my go-to people because we needed SWAT assets and EOD assets in the downtown, expecting that a further incident would happen. They responded immediately and gave us all the equipment available in Massachusetts to respond to this thing. They were literally there within 30 minutes. The first victims were evacuated within 22 minutes, and within 30 minutes we had every SWAT team in the Commonwealth either on site or on the way to Ring Road, which is where we had our first meeting and command post. The information sharing that we did beforehand to prepare for the marathon was good. We certainly need to look at everything we did, and the Senator's comments are well taken. Everything that we did has to be reviewed so that we make sure that this does not happen again, and we're in the process of doing that. But until all the facts are out on the table, it's hard to say what we could have done differently. But I'm satisfied with the preparation that we put in place. And after 9/11, I met with Director Mueller from the FBI with several police chiefs just 2 or 3 days after the incident. And he committed to including us in the JTTFs, and he's been good to his word. This is not a perfect process, but we are real members of that organization. I have 3 detectives and a sergeant that are at the JTTF every day and working very closely with the Bureau. We certainly need to enlist the community better. And the points about identifying radical extremism and ferreting that out, the first thing that we need to do is go to the community. We need to explain to the community that they have a responsibility to their community and to their nation and to what's right to report the kind of activity that these brothers were involved in prior to the incident. And I think that's the first line of defense. There's going to be a lot of conversation about cameras and other technical means. There's no technical means that you can point to. There's no computer that's going to spit out a terrorist name. It's the community being involved in the conversation and being appropriately open to communicating with law enforcement when something awry is identified. That really needs to happen. And so that should be our first step. And do we have to look at cameras? Sure we do. Do we have to look at more bomb dogs? Do we have to look at utilizing the assets that the Department of Homeland Security and the federal government have provided us? We do have to do that, and it's really important. The training that you alluded to, Mr. Chairman, extremely important. It made all the difference in the world in our response here. People are alive today because of Urban Shield and the terrorism training that the Department of Homeland Security provided to us. There is no doubt about that, and further investment needs to be made in those things. Moving forward, the help of the federal government was critical to our response here. We need to look at how it happened and why it happened, and we need to do everything we can to prevent it. But the truth of the matter is, nobody bats 1,000. And I think that as a nation, we need to come to terms with it and do everything we can to prevent it, but also recognize that fusion centers and intelligence analysis and joint terrorism task forces are part of our future. Boston is an international city, and we derive an enormous benefit from the people who come to Boston for school and for hospital care and just to be part of our community. But the world is a dangerous place, and I think we need to recognize that and be prepared for it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let me just say, on behalf of the committee, we thank you for your efforts, your department, our hearts really go out to the victims and their families, both those killed and then the 260 that were wounded on a battlefield, many of whom I believe your department and the first responders saved on that day. So let me just say thank you for that. And the chair now recognizes the Undersecretary Schwartz for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee. On behalf of Governor Patrick, I thank you for this opportunity to share thoughts and insights as you take your first look at the tragic events related to the Boston Marathon bombings. The week of April 15 in and around Boston demonstrated the value of our investments of money, time, and resources in our local, state, and federal Homeland Security enterprise. Within seconds of the bomb blasts at the finish line of the marathon, an array of personnel, resources, and capabilities, many of which were funded with Homeland Security grant dollars, were brought to bear to triage and care for the wounded, communicate with the public, provide situational awareness for decision makers, ensure the safety and security of the public and critical infrastructure, set up a joint command center, and ultimately identify and apprehend the suspected terrorists. The speed with which Boston responded, supported by the state police, the National Guard, the transit police, and dozens of local, regional, state, and federal law enforcement agencies and other first responders, is a testament to the Homeland Security spending and investments in preparedness, training and exercises, effective mutual aid systems, coordinated response systems, and outstanding leadership. I speak with firsthand knowledge of the heroic work done by our public safety team on April 15 and in the following days. I arrived on Boylston Street only minutes after the blast, where I joined city and state public safety officials, including Commissioner Davis and Colonel Albin of the Massachusetts State Police. And I was still with this team, privileged to be with this team 4 days later, when the last of the suspected terrorists was captured in Watertown. I commend Governor Patrick and members of his administration, including Secretary of Public Safety Cabral, the State Police, the Transit Police, the National Guard. And I also commend Commissioner Davis, the men and women he commands, and the first responders from the Boston Fire Department and Boston EMS, and the many other local, state, and federal public safety agencies that responded into Boston for their extraordinary performance under horrific circumstances. As you all know, April 15 marked the 117th running of the Boston Marathon, one of the most prestigious marathons in the world. In Massachusetts, quite simply, the marathon is a big deal. And public safety for the marathon also is a big deal. For local, regional, and state public safety officials, the Boston Marathon is one of our largest annual events, and we appropriately dedicate substantial planning and operational resources to protect as best we can the runners and spectators and the 8 cities and towns that host the race. On April 15, the public safety community was prepared. As it has done in the past, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, brought together a multi-agency, multi-discipline team last January that spent 3 months developing the operational plans, the coordination plans for this year's marathon. On race day, an 80-person multi-agency coordination center was operational at MEMA. Representatives from Boston's police, fire, and EMS services and public safety personnel from the other 7 cities and towns along the 26-mile course were present in the center, along with key state and federal agencies such as the Massachusetts State Police, Department of Fire Services, Office of Emergency Medical Services, Public Health, National Guard, the Commonwealth Fusion Center, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the FAA, the Coast Guard, and our partners, the Boston Athletic Association. And along the 26-mile course, local, regional, and state tactical teams, hazardous materials response teams, EOD teams, the National Guard Civil Support Team, mobile command posts, and state police helicopters were deployed as part of an all-hazards operational plan. In short, when the 27,000 runners started the race in Hopkinton, as a community, we were prepared from the starting line to the finish line in Boston. As we well know, at 2:50 p.m. April 15th, two powerful bombs were intentionally detonated 12 seconds apart on Boylston Street, within a short distance of the finish line. The results were catastrophic. 3 people killed and over 250 injured, dozens of them seriously. The response by the public, by bystanders, witnesses, and volunteers in those moments after the blast was nothing short of remarkable. And the public safety response was equally incredible. The response that I witnessed speaks volumes about the investments that we have made in the Commonwealth to enhance our homeland security. From a high-level systemic view, several common themes and key factors stand out as we assess the massive, swift, and effective public safety response to the bombings. There is a clear correlation, as others have said, between the effectiveness of response operations in the aftermath of the bombings and our homeland security investments. The response to the bombings relied heavily on specialized capabilities that have been built and sustained through our homeland security programs. The response to the bombings was augmented through pre-existing inter- and intrastate mutual aid agreements that have been built on regional response strategies and plans. Interoperability was a huge success story. Over the years, the millions of dollars that we have invested under local, regional, and state interoperability plans ensured that responders and command personnel were able to effectively communicate between agencies, between disciplines, and between jurisdictions. We benefited from our history of using pre-planned events like the marathon as real-life opportunities to exercise and utilize our command posts and our emergency operations centers, to test our plans and mutual aid systems, to activate our specialized response teams, to stay familiar with the technology systems that we rely on during emergencies, and to strengthen personal and professional relationships amongst people, agencies, disciplines, and jurisdictions that otherwise may not have opportunities to work together. We benefited from our investments in regional exercise programs that allow first responders to hone specialized skills and gain familiarity with responders from other areas who may be called in to support mutual aid under mutual aid agreements. The cooperation and collaboration across agencies, disciplines, and jurisdictions was immediate and extraordinary. There was unity of focus and unity of purpose at the command level and through the ranks, all the way down to the first responders on Boylston Street on April 15th, and to the 1,000-plus police officers that participated in the state's largest manhunt on April 18 and 19. The relationship between public safety leaders and public officials at all times was open, positive, and constructive. Governor Patrick and Mayor Menino regularly communicated with each other and consulted with and were briefed by their public safety leaders, such as Commissioner Davis and Colonel Albin of the state police. Their decisions were informed by and reflected public safety concerns, needs, and objectives, and this fostered constructive decision-making and opportunities for bold, out-of-the-box decisions. The support from the federal government, as you have heard from others, was immediate and effective. I need to personally thank FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, all of whom were on the ground and with us and supported us throughout this week-long event. And finally, local and state public safety and emergency management agencies effectively communicated with the public through social media, reverse 911 system.
Because of this, they knew the target environment, did not require training to familiarize themselves with the area and its protective measures. Put simply, the Tsarnaev brothers were homegrown violent extremists. And because of them, Boston joins a collection of cities around the world that have endured terrorist attacks, plotted and executed by their own residents, even as the extremist ideology to which they ascribed was likely influenced by ideas created and embraced elsewhere in the world. Much like the Madrid train bombings in 2004, as well as the July 2005 bombings in London, the terrorist familiarity with the target area afforded them critical situational awareness that facilitated their ability to plan and execute a local attack. As a starting point for any analysis on this tragic event, It is essential to explore why and how these incidents happen and available options to reduce the risk of future attacks. In the context of our country, homegrown violent extremism, or HVE, describes terrorist activity or plots targeting the United States or United States assets by American citizens or residents who have embraced their extremist ideology largely within this country. A precursor to HVE is a process of radicalization. Though, like the term terrorism, the concept of radicalization is widely referenced but remains poorly defined. The term is not limited to any one racial, religious, or issue-oriented group. Radicalization is a process whereby individuals identify, embrace, and engage in furthering extremist ideologies. The final element, engagement, is one part of the indoctrination pathway continuum which has the potential to yield violent extremist activities. An examination of radicalization yields broad questions regarding how a person becomes engaged, stays engaged, or may actually disengage from a group or extremist ideology. Terrorism requires a combination of three things: an alienated individual, a legitimizing ideology engaged through radicalization, and an enabling environment. Of the three, it is the environment that is most susceptible to positive influences that, supported by appropriate policies and behaviors, can reduce the risk of homegrown violent extremism. As law enforcement and counterterrorism officials analyze the Boston Marathon attacks, we should resist the urge to fix something absent specific evidence or some failure of compromise of the system until all the facts are in. Security is comprised of policies, processes, and technology. As it relates to environments like sporting events or critical infrastructure, the emphasis should be on policies that are risk-based, that is, focused on threats that present the most danger and are most likely to occur. We have the applied research capacity to and do model potential attack paths given a desirability or utility yielded to an adversary. Citizen awareness, actionable intelligence, and interdisciplinary methodologies such as our successful application of game theory randomization around the country, in addition to other new available cutting-edge technologies currently being tested in the United States and in Brazil in cooperation with the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics, will continue to hold significant importance for holistic countermeasure strategies. At the same time, recognizing that the goal is to contain terrorism, we should seek out and prioritize opportunities to engage communities to take part in disrupting the radicalization process that could ultimately lead to violent action. One challenge in this case is the role of online media can play in fostering violent extremism. Arguably, the internet's capacity for propelling extremists through the radicalization process is the single most important and dangerous innovation since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The internet, in some ways, is a virtual community, and future attacks against the United States and its interests will likely involve adversaries who have traversed the radicalization process, at least in part, online. Securing a democratic society is a formidable challenge, and we will never be completely free of a terrorist threat. Protecting the country is an ongoing effort that must remain versatile in the face of creative and adaptive adversaries. Every step towards greater security is matched with a would-be terrorist exploitation of an unaddressed vulnerability. There is no finish line in Homeland Security. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Professor. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. Commissioner Davis, first I'd like to start with you. As I said, post-bombing, the actions of the police department and all law enforcement, federal, state, and local, was unparalleled. I commend that. But I'd like to ask you a few questions about before the bombing. Before the bombing, were you aware of the Russian intelligence warning regarding Tamerlan and the fact that he may travel overseas to meet with extremists?
We have three detectives and a sergeant who were assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. One of my detectives is actually in the squad that investigated that. We have access to all the databases. but we were not, in fact, informed of that particular development.
So it's fair to say that your police officers assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force did not know this information.
That's correct.
Would you have liked to have known that information?
In hindsight, certainly.
Before the bombing, were you aware that based on this Russian intelligence that the FBI opened an investigation into Tamerlan?
We were not aware of that.
Would you have liked to have known about that?
Yes.
Before the bombing, were you aware that Mr. Tamerlan traveled to the Chechen region?
No, we were not.
Again, would you like to have known that?
Yes.
Before the bombing, were you told that he posted radical jihadist video websites online?
No, Mr. Chairman, we were not aware of the two brothers. We were not aware of Tamerlan's activities.
And again, would you like to have known that fact?
Yes, sir.
We know there was a Department of Homeland Security officer in the Joint Terrorism Task Force who was alerted of Mr. Tamerlan's overseas trip to Russia and the Chechen region. Were you aware of that information before the bombing?
I was not.
Were the officers that you assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force aware of this?
They tell me they received no word on that individual prior to the bombing.
After the bombing, were you made aware of this information?
Yes.
And at what point in time was that?
The information started to come in immediately upon our identification of Mr. Tamerlan, of the older brother, on the morning of the Watertown arrest. So the shootout occurred late in the evening on Thursday into Friday, and Friday in the early morning hours we started to get information about the identity of the individuals.
And Commissioner Davis, if you had this information before the bombing, would you have done, your police force and you, would you have done anything differently?
That's very hard to say. We would certainly look at the information. We would certainly talk to the individual. From the information I've received, the FBI did that and they closed the case out. I can't say that I would have come to a different conclusion based upon the information that was known at that particular time.
But if you knew of a Russian intelligence warning that this man was an extremist that may travel overseas, and the fact that he did travel overseas and came back into the United States, would that may not have caused you to give this individual a second look?
Absolutely.
Undersecretary Schwartz, the Department of Homeland Security funds these fusion centers. Was the fusion center given any of this information that I just asked the commissioner?
Like the Boston Police Department, the state police through the Commonwealth Fusion Center has, I believe, 7 troopers assigned on a full-time basis to the JTTF. My understanding is that at no time prior to the bombings did any member of the Massachusetts State Police or the Fusion Center have any information or knowledge about the Tsarnaev brothers.
So, this is the whole point of having fusion centers and joint terrorism task forces, is to share information and coordinate. I used to work with the joint terrorism task forces, but the idea that the feds have this information and it's not shared with the state and locals defies, why we created the Department of Homeland Security in the first place. And it's very troubling to me. Senator Lieberman, you went through a litany of cases where individuals, Alaki, Bledsoe, the Fort Hood shooting that you did a fantastic investigation, looking at why the dots weren't connected. Here we are 12 years later. We put billions of dollars into this. Why are we still having problems connecting the dots?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me first say that the line of questioning that you've just carried out with Commissioner Davis and Secretary Schwartz and their answers are very important. And this may be one of the most significant and painful takeaway lessons from the Boston Marathon terrorist attacks, because particularly when you're dealing with homegrown radicals, the the community around them is probably going to be your first line of defense, and state and local law enforcement will always have a better knowledge of the neighborhood, of the institutions that the people might be involved in. So I'd say that the fact that neither the FBI nor the Department of Homeland Security, in the one case of that Customs and Border Protection agent, didn't notify the local members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Boston is really a serious and aggravating omission. And so look, you know, as the commissioner said, nobody bats 1,000%. It's true. And FBI and DHS, I'm probably one of their biggest fans and admirers in the country. But here was a case, and they've got to look back at it themselves. Why didn't they involve the local law enforcers who could have stayed on this case and picked up signals from some of the students who interacted with them, from the people in the mosque who threw out Tamerlan because he was such an extremist, seen the videos that he posted when he came back from Dagestan that could have prevented all this from happening. And so how do you explain it? You know, people are imperfect, but information is being shared in a technological way constantly. A lot of the old stovepipes have come down, but in this case, aggravatingly, you have two of our great Homeland Security agencies that didn't involve, before the event, the local and state authorities that could have helped us prevent the attack on the marathon.
And in closing, I completely agree with you, Senator. We have stopped so many of these cases, and they're very difficult to stop. And I do applaud, you know, the FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, Department of Homeland Security, state and locals. But I'm concerned and troubled by the fact that maybe in this case, that it wasn't shared even within the federal government jurisdictionally, and it certainly, by the testimony here today, was not shared with the state and locals, which you've, I think, very excellently pointed out, are really the eyes and ears because they're on the ground. And if just maybe someone had looked at him when he came back, just going up on his YouTube website, may have possibly seen that this person had radicalized after he came back from a very dangerous part of the world. And so with that, I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Massachusetts, Representative Markey, be permitted to sit for the purpose of questioning the witnesses at today's hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Commissioner Davis, one of the other responsibilities we have as a committee is to look at what actually happened. If, in fact, the monies that we have provided to your department were not available, and the training that went with the money as well as the equipment, how would you have been able to respond to that situation?
Our response would have been much less comprehensive than it was. We have received, just in the area of ordnance disposal, we've received funding to put trucks and equipment, protective equipment for our offices. Sergeant Chris Conley was there. He had just done something called cut and tags on a bunch of parcels that had been left by people running away from the incident. And it was very dangerous work, and I got to talk to him when he was putting his equipment on. He was clearing literally hundreds of potential bombs. Very dangerous work that could not have been done safely without the money that we received from the federal government. The training that we've received has given us an opportunity to test our systems, and we have discovered gaps in radio communications, for instance, that were closed because of the training. And those gaps being closed caused us to be able to communicate with fire and other responding agencies interoperably. We were not even aware that we had the problem until we did the scenario training. So the answer to your question is the response would have been much less than it was.
Thank you. And those funds have been an integral part of your department's ability to respond like it has been. And
right. That funding has not only set up response on the street, but has also put our fusion center, called the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, that operation has been put together with federal funding. It helps us not only with the threat of terrorism, but also with the threat of homicide and other things that we deal with in the urban environment. That money is critical to our operation of the police department.
thank you. Professor Southers, you're a former FBI agent. Commissioner talked about the need to engage immigrant communities, regardless of who they are, in this total process for identifying potential terrorists in our communities. Can you share with me your experience on the community engagement aspect of what we're talking about?
Yes, sir, I can. The commissioner is absolutely right that, with all due respect to intelligence that comes in, the most valuable information that you're going to obtain are from those community members, those family members, in this case perhaps those members of the mosque, who could have shared some information that the Joint Terrorism Task Force could have worked on. We've seen in the past where, in a number of instances, we're working with the community, although it didn't stop people from leaving this country and engaging elsewhere, we were aware of, in fact, activities that were going on. To name a few, Adam Gaddan, who is with Al-Qaeda and still outstanding, possibly in Yemen, was thrown out of the mosque in Orange County, California, but not before the people in the JTTF and the FBI were aware of the fact of what was going on down there. Samir Khan, and I know that Inspire magazine has been referred to a number of times since the incident. Samir Khan is an American. He was the editor-in-chief of Inspire magazine. He was in North Carolina and engaged by his family and members of the mosque, and unfortunately was able to leave the country before that information became known. It would have been very valuable. And then last but not least, Omar Hamami, who's from Alabama and has left the country, but again was engaged by his family and members of the community about the fact that he was taking on a form of Islam that was not appropriate, and is now engaged in Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia. So that kind of information coming from the communities that we need to help us is critical, and it's very important that we don't engage in any activities that would compromise that relationship and, in fact, stigmatize that community from coming forward to let the appropriate authorities know what was going on.
Thank you. Senator Lieberman, good seeing you again. I'm sure that the next life you now serve is a far less stressful one.
Well, there is, one of my former colleagues in the Senate refers to it as the afterlife. So it's okay out here, but I hope you and the others will stay here and do the important work you're doing.
And I wanted to get your comments. We have invested significant resources in getting communities and states where they can respond, as the commissioner said. But also I heard you over time express concern that the government's proposal to eliminate grants to state and localities is probably not what we ought to be doing. Can you share that, your thoughts on that?
Yes, sir. Thanks, Congressman Thompson. Great to be with you again. We're in a war, and as I said, it's against an ideology that is not receding. It's spreading, and it's taken a very difficult turn, which is, as we saw in the Boston case, because the only 3 attacks against America, terrorist attacks that have succeeded since 9/11, are homegrown terrorists. You can't fight this war without resources. I mean, the Homeland Security front is no different than the Department of Defense. And the grants that we have created and funded have been critically important in this battle. And again, I come back to the fact that particularly with homegrown terrorists, the state and local law enforcers are in the best position to create the relationships within the communities that will allow them, and have allowed them in numerous cases, to stop terrorist attacks before they occur. And they're simply not going to do it without funding. Every level of government is pinched. There are a couple of police departments in our country, notably New York and Los Angeles, that spend a lot of money funding counterterrorism programs, and a lot of those programs are outreach to the community. And it's part of the reason why they've been so effective. In a way, part of what we're all saying here, at least I'm saying, is that we have to rely more in this new phase of this war with terrorism on the state and locals, and they can't do it without financial help from the federal government.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chairman, I recognize the former chairman of the committee, Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you for scheduling this hearing. It's absolutely vital, and I commend you for it. Commissioner Davis, first of all, thank you for your leadership. It was absolutely phenomenal. Let me just ask you, though, from the time of the attack on Monday afternoon until the shootout early Friday morning, did the FBI bring to your attention at all the fact that the older brother had been under investigation by the FBI?
No, we didn't start to look at that until after the shootout.
So this is 3.5 days after, and the FBI still did not make you aware of it?
That's correct. I should stress that there was an ongoing investigation and a lot of information coming in from a lot of different sources. But the answer to your question is no, we didn't look at the brothers until after the shootout.
After the photos were posted late Thursday afternoon, did anyone from the local mosque come forward to identify either of the brothers?
I'm not certain of that. I don't know of anyone that did, but I know that there was some conversation with a group that we meet with frequently from the mosques called Bridges, but I'm not quite sure what their role was in the conversation.
Could you checking back to us on whether or not, because to me, if their photos are all over television, someone should have recognized them from the mosque.
By all means.
Also, did any students from UMass Dartmouth come forward to identify the younger brother?
They did not.
Senator Lieberman, first of all, it's wonderful to see you here today. During the time I was ranking member and chairman, I didn't work more closely with anyone than you. Conference committees, legislation, the joint hearing we held on Islamic radicalization in the military, I want to thank you for that. In your statement, though, you must mention any number of times the term violent Islamist ideology, violent Islamist extremism. I have not heard one administration official, including the Attorney General and the President, use the term Islamist. As Chairman McCall said, how are we going to know the enemy if we don't identify the enemy?
Well, I agree with that. Look, we know that there are other sources of terrorism than violent Islamist extremism. We know that from the Oklahoma City bombing. We know it from the Unabomber. But it was self-evidently and publicly violent Islamist extremism that led to the attacks against us on 9/11/01, and didn't take detective work. Osama bin Laden and everybody else declared that to be the purpose. They want to bring down America and our civilization. And it's the old Chinese wisdom, millennia ago. The first thing you got to know in war is who your enemy is, and you have to call it by its name. Now, I understand the sensitivity here, but I think in some sense it's unfair to the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the world, and particularly our fellow Americans who are Muslim, to leave it unspoken as if somehow they're part of this. It's obvious that the violent Islamist extremists are a very, very, very small minority of the community. The community in America, which is the one I can speak about, is as we all know from our friends and neighbors, is law-abiding and patriotic. And I don't think we do any service to them. In some sense, it's almost unfair not to call this by its name. We're all looking for the right words to distinguish this small group of radicals, extremist terrorists from the great majority of overwhelming majority of Muslims in this country, and maybe we haven't found the right words, but In this case, what I gather happened in the mosque in Boston is very instructive. When Tamerlan Tsarnaev came back from his trip overseas, he was clearly radicalized, and he began to speak in such an extremist way that I gather the people in the mosque asked him to leave. Well, that's representative of, if I can say, the mainstream Muslim community in our country.
Senator, I'm running out of time.
I'm sorry.
One statement I'd like to make for the record, Mr. Chairman. We're talking about the lack of information sharing. I think it's absolutely indefensible that the FBI found out on Sunday that there was a planned attack against Times Square and never notified the NYPD. Here's a city that's been attacked twice, has 16 plots against it, and the FBI refused to give that information to the NYPD. And their reaction, when Commissioner Kelly and Mayor Bloomberg and I went public, was to criticize us, saying we were somehow compromising the investigation. At the same time, saying the reason they didn't give the information to the NYPD because there was no threat, that it was not a real threat. They can't have it both ways, and the failure to share information is absolutely indefensible. And I think they owe everyone an explanation as to why they withhold information. And to me, it fits right into this pattern of keeping it to themselves and not sharing and not intending it to stop attacks. I just can't explain it. I can't understand it. And to me, it's a severe breakdown in law enforcement. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. That's certainly something this committee will be looking into. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I find this to be an overwhelming experience to the witnesses. Let me thank you very much to be in this place and to be speaking about an attack on our soil. I think it is important as I take a moment just to call the names of Martin, the youngest of 8 years old, Crystal, and Miss Lindsay, and Officer Sean Collier. We should always take a moment, just a moment, to recognize them. I want to proceed with first enormous thanks, Commissioner Davis, for the leadership and heroics of everybody in Boston and our first responders. Many of us have worked with officers throughout our professional life. Again, we thank you, and we thank the people of Boston and your great state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
It's kind of you. Thank you, Congressman.
I want to pursue Senator Lieberman, a thorn that if you can pursue for me, and we are limited in this time frame, the Russian contact. It still baffles all of us, in spite of diplomacy issues, why, if nothing else, that was not a trigger in our various centers, the Joint Terrorism Center, to one, probe and to one, pursue that information and share it with our local law enforcement. What do you think happened?
Congresswoman Lee, great to see you again. I agree with you. Again, as you said, hindsight is always clearer. But this was an unusual circumstance for Russian intelligence to notify us about two Americans, really, that included the mother, originally, the Tsarnaev mother, in this case. Now, we understand that we're operating in a context of mistrust between U.S. intelligence and Russian intelligence, and yet there is cooperation in some areas. So as I look back at this, it seems to me that the fact that this original notification, you kind of look back as you investigate what went wrong, to at what points could somebody have acted to stop this? This really should have raised it, this case, to a very high profile internally because of where it came from. And now, as I said it in my opening statement, it could be that the most consequential failure to share information was the failure of the Russian intelligence to explain in more detail to us why they were interested in Tamerlan Tsarnaev. But if it had been raised to that level, and that's why I hope you'll go back and speak with the FBI and the Attorney General's office, take another look at those Attorney General guidelines to see if in any way they constrained the FBI from acting more aggressively or sharing the information with the state and local law enforcers.
Let me ask the chairman, thank you, a unanimous consent to put a number of questions in the record.
Without objection.
And to put an article from the Washington Post dated today in the record. Thank you very much. Let me go to Commissioner Davis and just simply say that this probe has to continue. In the course of information coming to you, did the Homeland Security department provide you with any information about the student visa or the visa of any of the second-tier individuals that were arrested earlier than the fact of the bombing that occurred? Did you get any information about there was some concern about the visas dealing with the senior brother and then the others?
We did not. We have a Homeland Security analyst in our BRIC, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, but neither the BRIC nor the JTTF.
And you feel confident you could have acted on that information, or at least had a structure in your operation that could have looked at that?
We certainly have a structure that would have looked at it, yes.
And at this point, is there any mass labeling of the Muslim community in Boston?
That's always a concern of ours. I've met with members of that community, and they're concerned about it, but there have been no incidents reported to me.
Professor Souther, what would be the better way of dealing with the vast number of Muslims in this nation that, in essence, pay their taxes, serve in the United States military, and call this country a country that they love? How do we work with this community for those 100%, 99% who want to do well?
Congressman, the most important thing we can do right now is to build a bridge instead of a wall. Any community or family can facilitate radicalization by inaction, and that is what we don't want at this point. We want an engaged community. We want a community that feels comfortable and confident in sharing information. As we've seen time and time again, as the Senator alluded to, a number of thwarted plots have come because we've had an engaged community. So at this point, bridges are very important.
I thank you. And is this a partisan? I think, Senator Lieberman, you made a very good point. So let me just conclude on the record that this tragedy, as for those of us who started on the Homeland Security Committee and the Select Committee on Homeland devising this department, this is not a place to raise a partisan divide between Congress and the administration. This is a place to stand against this ever happening again. Professor, would you say that?
Absolutely, Congressman.
Senator Lieberman?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. That's most important. Should be unifying, really, because we're all in this together.
Absolutely, to save lives. I thank you, and I yield back.
Excellent point. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman. And again, we've all said thank you, and we just can't say thank you enough. Our internal gratitude and gratefulness and admiration for what all of you have done on that terrible, terrible day. And I was mentioning to the commissioner before we came in here, one of the counties I represent has an annual breakfast where all the first responders, emergency management come. It was last week. We had 700 people, and it was almost the entire topic of conversation over in Michigan about what you all did in Boston and how well you reacted and how you responded. And that one of the most heartening things, I think, and anybody that was watching the TVs that didn't have tears in their eyes when they watched all the people on the sidelines as you were exiting the neighborhoods after you caught the second murder, people applauding the first responders. That was a remarkable moment, I think, for every American, and certainly something that none of us will ever forget. And one of the things that Senator Lieberman mentioned, when you said the battlefield, you mentioned that Christmas Day bomber. I just pick up on that because I'm from Detroit, and we are facing a new type of enemy now, something that our country has not faced in the past, who see the battlefield asymmetrically, who see the battlefield in a different way. The battlefield that day was seat 19A of that Northwest flight for that murderer. Attempted murder, and the battlefield then was at the end of the Boston Marathon. And so there's been a lot of talk about information sharing, and I'm very appreciative of the questions and the comments about that. But I guess my question today would be about how, as we go forward, how we can better resource and utilize existing resources for our first responders, not only at 9/11, when we remember it was the first responders who responded, not really the military. In this case, of course, we had the National Guard that were force multiplier for you. And I think as in these days of economic times, perhaps there's a way, and I would ask for some comments on that. How did the National Guard actually meld into your what you were doing there. And I ask that because I'm wondering if there's a way, as we are resourcing the National Guard, whose role really has changed and expanded since 9/11, and we all have National Guard units in every state, about doing perhaps joint training exercises with our first responders, all kinds of various things that they may be able to utilize that you could utilize as well. I mean, I've got a big National Guard just outside of Detroit. We have a big National Guard base there, and they're everywhere, really. Perhaps this is a way that we could have them share information, even though they're under DOD. Really, I think there's a lot of application, things that we are already resourcing through the Department of Defense, through the National Guard, that may have we could utilize better from training exercises, etc., with the first responders. I don't know what you think of that, Commissioner, if you have any comments on that.
I don't know what the national standard is, but I can tell you in the city of Boston and throughout Massachusetts, the National Guard has been at the table for all of our training exercises back to just after 9/11. One of the big roles that they played immediately after was the CBRN detection and having units that could come in and monitor to make sure there were no chemicals or other things that we had to be concerned about in the environment. But the day of the marathon, they were an integral part of our preparation. They had already been deployed prior to the bombing to assist us in our traffic control and security operations. So there were several hundred National Guards people at the scene, and the general came right into the command post, one of the first people to arrive. He was tremendously helpful. By the end of the day, we had over 1,500 troops available to us, assisting our officers in securing, as I described, the most complex crime scene that we'd ever processed in the city of Boston. And those troops stayed on the ground for a 7-day period until that scene was shut down. But more than just perimeter security, they arrived at the scene of the pursuit and brought equipment in, and at one point we needed 3 of our SWAT teams to deploy out to Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and they brought in helicopters to make that happen. Blackhawks came in and took the teams out. The state police have helicopters, but they were nowhere as near as large as what we needed to move people around. So General Rice played a very critical role in not only preparation and prevention, but also in response after the incident happened.
I appreciate that. My time is up, but I asked that question. I'm so delighted to hear all of that, because I think that's an area where we can, I think as a Congress, needs to think about melding some of the various things that are happening with the National Guard in response to with the first responders, et cetera. As I'm just in my own area there, on our National Guard base, we actually have a Air and Marine Wing from the Department of Homeland Security with an operational integration center, which all the information is fed by all the affected stakeholders and then used principally for border security. But we've used the National Guard along the border, but I just think there's something that the Congress needs to think about more. So I'm very appreciative of your answer. Thanks. And I yield back my time.
Thank the Vice Chair. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to delve quickly into while everything was going on. After the explosion, the big picture is just an extraordinary coordination. Amazing, all that training, all that effort, and heroism that was involved in that. But I think we want to look carefully at some of the information sharing even during that period. And you mentioned, Commissioner Davis, that you first learned of the individuals of the terrorists Friday morning. Just the senseless killing of Officer Collier. At that moment, can you share with us who linked that in first to the terrorist attack, how that information was conveyed to you, how soon were you able to put the identities of these people and connect it to that atrocity as well?
Right. I can certainly speak about the pursuit of these individuals. I hesitate to get too far into who knew what when as far as the identification, because it's part of the ongoing criminal case. But let me do the best I can to answer your question. We received word of Officer Collier's murder within 30 minutes of the incident occurring. I received a call at my home.
From whom?
I received a call from Superintendent Paul Fitzgerald, who was at the FBI command post at that time. But the information that we had received was that it was most likely associated with an armed robbery that had occurred prior. They were not establishing a link to our investigation at that point in time. But we were highly suspicious of it, and everybody was concerned about it. But after a couple of phone calls, we sent officers to assist. My chief of department went to the scene and had a conversation with the lieutenant colonel in charge of investigations for the state police, who was running that scene. And the first indications were it's probably not related. But after the carjacking occurred, it was clear that there was something going on. We deployed more officers into the area at that point, and certainly as soon as the Watertown officer engaged the suspect, and there were reports of firepower and bombs being involved, there was no doubt in our mind. So that's the way the thing progressed.
Right, and when you were informed Friday morning about the identities, who conveyed that to you?
The FBI. The FBI teams had been sent to process the body, and they were very quick to identify who the individual was that was killed in the shootout.
Yeah, this is going on so many levels. The area that I think is worth pursuing, it was mentioned here, is the messages that received from Russia. And I'm curious about people's thoughts. I don't think there's anyone that would have an answer. But exactly, when the FBI tried to get more information, if they were so interested in this person and they initially informed the FBI, when the FBI tried to get further information from them, they didn't get any, even though they had asked. And I know there's just such a history of distrust, but there's such an opportunity for mutual benefit in terms of both countries' security in these areas, especially in the Caucasus region. But it's clear that the insurgents in the Caucasus region now are just not focusing only on Russia, but Western Europe and the U.S. now. So this communication is going to be so important. Either Professor Southers or perhaps Senator Lieberman, you could shed some light on how we can pursue better communications when it's so much in our benefit to do that.
Thanks, Congressman. I think you're onto something very important. I mean, look, I'm sure you know that particularly, well, in the aftermath of 9/11, a remarkable and very important transformation has occurred in the FBI, which is that it has become a first-rate domestic intelligence counterterrorism agency. And as part of that, offices have been opened around the world, including in Moscow, as part of to create the relationships that will lead to information that will enable them to better protect us here at home. And again, this is all part of an ongoing investigation. I urge you to bring in the folks from the FBI and the CIA to talk about this. But from what we know now, the notice from Russian intelligence to the FBI and the CIA was very vague, and of course, most significantly, as much as I know now, nothing was shared with us about what the Russian intelligence found out about what Tamerlan Tsarnaev was doing in Dagestan and Chechnya. There are media reports that he was meeting with a leader, a radical leader, et cetera, et cetera. We do know that when he came back, he showed much greater signs of overt extremism, as in the mosque which pushed him out. So, President Putin made a statement along, I believe, with President Obama, maybe it was with Secretary Kerry when he was there, that we have a common enemy here. It's true. And we should be working together better. And that's true. But that didn't happen in this case, and that was very consequential.
Yeah, quick question, if I could, Mr. Chairman, to Commissioner Davis or Undersecretary Schwartz. In New York, they have camera systems that are all synchronized and coordinated. Is that unique to New York? Is that a pilot, or they're trying to make the cameras that are there more efficient because of the coordination. I don't know how familiar you are. We had a witness last week from New York talking about that. Could that be helpful in other cities?
It's certainly not unique to New York. When we look across Massachusetts and our investment of Homeland Security grant dollars, whether it's UASI dollars, state Homeland Security grant dollars, transit grant dollars, we certainly have a history of investing in cameras, video surveillance. I have visited the BRIC, which has a quite complex, sophisticated system that within the city of Boston. We also have capabilities, for example, in the State Emergency Operations Center to tie into transit system cameras, highway system cameras. And I think in the days, weeks, months ahead, as we begin to process what we've been through and think about how we're going to deal with security around events in the future, we'll have to spend more time looking at and probably investing in not just in the cameras, but what we really need to also focus in is the analysis capability, the technology behind the cameras. Civil liberties always also being important, and we have to balance.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank each of the distinguished panelists. Let me start first, and Secretary Schwartz, Commissioner Davis, thank you for your great service, and obviously the worst of circumstances also give an opportunity to have people seen at their best, and I think Boston presented the best of what America is all about. I also think a theme of communication has come through here. I want to credit you with an important thing during the process. The ability for your entire group to communicate, and regularly through the media, but that created a sense of cohesion and an ability for America to follow on during a very difficult time. I think that was a critical thing. The second factor, you've noted in your written testimony, the ability to communicate among each other, which included as well the ability of a separate capacity for law enforcement across jurisdictions. It's a great story of steps that have been done. The last thing, however, is we've talked about communications you did not receive from the FBI or others, and I know nobody wants to go through this event, but you did. And the after-action report, the analysis, you'll watch the films, and it'll be one of the places we can learn, and so we encourage you to be critical as you go through that process and help us all learn together. But I congratulate you on the wonderful work. The issue of communication is an aspect of this, and how people are doing it today. One of the things that bothers me is Tamerlan Tsarnaev is identified as having watched online videos of Anwar al-Awlaki. We're seeing a bit more of that. We looked at hearings about people who did this. Senator, you've been discussing the idea that it's the ideology that is something we are focused on. Who has the responsibility to identify places where the ideology is being centralized and it's serving as the place that people are gravitating?
You had a very important question, not an easy one to answer. I mean, I can tell you, as you probably know, that there's a lot of monitoring going on now by American law enforcement agencies of violent or jihadist websites, of chat rooms, etc. And that's really been important. It's very hard to control, for instance, the uploading of violent YouTube sites. I mean, in this case, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, as we know, started a YouTube channel of his own in which he was putting on Awlaki and other violent Islamist extremist advocates. I forgot the number, but tens of thousands of such channels go up every hour on YouTube for a period of time. And Google YouTube has community standards, which are quite admirable, because they can't pre-screen everything that goes up. For a period of time, I had somebody on my Senate Homeland Security staff who was trying to follow these websites, and when he'd see one that was violent, he'd make a complaint to YouTube. They'd submit it to a board, and they pulled a lot of them down. In this case, so it's very hard to do this, so I don't want to go on too long and take your time. I say two things. In this case, what I'm agitated by, for all the reasons we've talked about, is why nobody was particularly looking for the name Tamerlan Tsarnaev. By the time he came back from Chechnya, Dagestan, and put up that channel of his, somebody should have been on him. The second and the most important responders to this ideology are people within the Muslim community. And again, they obviously are the great majority, overwhelming, that don't accept this ideology. The rest of us can try by our outreach and by our advocacy to confront the ideology. But they're our allies. The Muslim American community is probably one of our greatest allies in this effort to stop the ideology. It's not as easy as stopping an enemy. Forgive me, but as thrilled as I was when we took down Osama bin Laden, and as hard as that was, that was a direct target. It's a lot harder to confront an ideology and to overwhelm it.
How do we connect the guidelines? I mean, do we have to change Department of Justice guidelines with respect to how far they can continue to hold investigations open? And do we go back and revisit whether or not people have visited these kinds of jihadist websites once we have had some kind of a predisposition when there's already been a report, as you said? I mean, where do we start to... I'm disturbed that the FBI would have had information which we've already identified, which made him a suspect, or at least a person of concern. They closed the book, but subsequently we discovered what you've just talked about, which is his participation in the violent jihadist websites.
Well, I don't have a quick answer to that question, but I'll tell you, I've learned enough from this case, and I appreciate your question, to feel very strongly that this committee, that the administration, the Department of Justice have to review the existing Attorney General guidelines for investigations by the FBI, and most importantly and directly to determine whether those guidelines constrain the FBI to stop prematurely, as we look back now, stop the investigation of Tamerlan Tsarnaev after they were notified by the Russians. And did they in any way send a message to the FBI agents that they shouldn't share this information with the local law enforcement until they had a greater level of proof that a crime was about to be committed? That's a very high standard. It's so high that it probably won't allow law enforcement to act before the crime, or in this case, the terrorist attack occurs.
Well, thank you, Senator. My time has expired, but Mr. Chairman, I do hope that's an issue that we can use as a stepping off point for the committee.
Excellent point. You being a former U.S. attorney, me a federal prosecutor, I think these AG guidelines need to be looked at. And with that, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Commissioner Davis, I also want to thank you, and through you, the first responders who responded so heroically and capably after the attacks. Really appreciate that. And I also want to tell you that I appreciate your comments about the difficulty in balancing greater scrutiny with the community policing that you must do in order to be successful. And like you, I live in an international community in El Paso, Texas, one whose success is predicated on our relationship with Mexico, on our ability to welcome immigrants. And I think our chief of police and our sheriff in El Paso would agree with me in saying that we have routinely been named one of the safest, if not the safest cities over the last 10 years, in large part because of our immigrant community and not despite it. And following on the chairman's remarks about terrorists who would seek to force us to change our way of life, in El Paso, our way of life has already been changed following this Boston attack. You know, now students who are coming across our international bridges to attend school at the University of Texas at El Paso are undergoing secondary inspection. We received calls yesterday, some are being detained up to 8 hours as they try to reconcile data between that shown on their visas and those in the computer systems that CBP is using. How, as someone who has this responsibility, what advice do you have for cities like ours to enable positive relations with the large immigrant communities there so that immigrants and their families feel comfortable coming to you with information that will help you in enforcing the law and keeping those communities safe, and at the same time balance the need for greater scrutiny and vigilance in ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again?
That is a great question, and there's a complex answer to it. It starts off with developing relationships in immigrant communities, something that we have paid particular attention to in Boston over the last 10 years, 15 years since community policing has been put into place. We do outreach in minority communities by doing community policing training in Spanish. We try to do specific outreach to the Latino community because there's been such an influx in some of our neighborhoods. I go to those classes and I listen in and I have an opportunity to talk to people who have newly immigrated to the United States, and they're incredibly thankful for the work that we're doing in outreach to them. And we have developed information, not through infiltration, but through appealing to their sense of community and nation. And I think that that's the answer to this in a large part. You can't develop a relationship with someone in a crisis. It has to be developed before the crisis. And so there has to be real attention paid to who's in our community and what are we doing to talk to them. We do that through outreach classes, but we're also having great luck with social media recently. And so the whole use of social media as a dialogue, not just a loudspeaker, but a dialogue between the police and the community, that plays an important role in our ability to do outreach to people. And as it relates to stops at the border, it's really important that the bureaucracy doesn't guide the whole interaction, that there's some human interaction there and some logic to those communications that happen at the border. And I think that's the key to it. The horror stories that we hear are usually a result of someone following a script that has rules and regulations but no logic to it. And I think there's a combination of both that needs to happen. But again, we're shooting for perfection, and it's difficult to achieve.
Yeah, as you said earlier, no one bats 1,000. And I'm concerned that we not overreact, and as Professor Suthers said, that we not try to fix something before all of the facts are in, or in fact we run the risk of changing our way of life and inadvertently compromising our ability to gain intelligence and to gain the cooperation of these immigrant communities. And I want to make sure, as someone who represents one of the largest immigrant communities in the United States, that is not what we do going forward, because it will, again, inadvertently compromise our ability to make our communities safer. So, again, I appreciate your answers, your comments, and the work that you and the people that you represent have done to make this country safer. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to advise members votes have been called. We have about 6.5 minutes. I'm going to allow Mr. Duncan to ask his line of questioning, and then we will, as I understand, recess. I understand the witnesses are willing to remain available. We'll be back after votes around 11:35. With that, Mr. Duncan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start off by saying that I believe that the former chairman of the committee, Peter King, needs an apology from mainstream media. He was vilified and demonized for holding radicalization hearings, and we saw just radicalization of Muslim youths happen with regard to Boston. And so that just want to throw that out there. I appreciate Chairman King's leadership as well as yours on this issue. Multiple conflicting reports indicate that Tamerlan may have been listed in one or more federal terrorist databases. We know the FBI's Tide database, but he possibly had a terrorist watch list or a terrorist screening database, TSDB, and possibly a Treasury Enforcement Communication System or TEX file. So multiple different hits in different databases that may have alerted someone in law enforcement that he was a danger.
And the federal government has known about information sharing challenges for years. And we talked about this in the last Congress and kind of pursuing some of that in this Congress about IT systems and communications and information sharing and cross-referencing. And I can do a Google search on Senator Lieberman and find out a lot, because these search engines are able to, on the private sector, able to interact and share and cross-reference that type of information. Since 2005, the GAO has sounded alarms about terrorist-related information sharing by placing it on its high-risk list. According to GAO, the federal government has made no substantial progress in developing a system to strengthen the sharing of intelligence, terrorism, law enforcement, and other information among all of its stakeholders, including federal, state, local, tribal, international, and private sector partners. And we just heard that the local and state law enforcement, as part of the JTTF, were not notified of information that the feds may have. So we're struggling to connect the dots with regard to the cross-referencing or information sharing. So if the dots had formed a picture or the intelligence had been shared more effectively, Commissioner, do you believe we could have prevented the attack?
I can't answer that in one word. It's hard. I think the answer is it's hard to say. Someone looked at this initial information and closed the case. So there was an assessment that there wasn't enough there to do anything more than an initial interview. That all has to be reviewed as to what factors occurred during the interview, and I haven't seen that information. There's then other information that's coming in that there were further databases that may have had wrong information in them. All of that has to be looked at very closely. And I guess in hindsight, if you were to be able to connect all the dots on that during that first interview, there might have been an open case there that would have caused the FBI to brief everyone in the JTTF on it, and we would all know about it, and we'd all make a decision as to what each particular agency wanted to do with that information. But you have to look at the timeline as to who knew what when to make a determination as to whether or not mistakes were made. And I don't have the answers to that right now. So if we knew everything that we know now, absent the blast, well, without the blast being involved in it, but if we knew all of these things that have come out since then, we would have taken a hard look at these individuals. But at this point in time, I can't say that when we knew things that we would have done anything differently.
And I'm just amazed that files were actually closed on someone who we were notified by a foreign country that he may had ties to terrorism, and they actually closed the file. That his name wasn't put into a system. And once we realized that this gentleman may be well, let me back up and say, I'm amazed that the American people, the general public in Boston, had to identify this guy, that somebody within the FBI or JTTF didn't go, wait a minute, that guy looks familiar. Didn't we investigate him a couple of years ago? We had to rely on the folks that within the Boston community to identify him. And one thing we talked about in this committee is the fact that CBP has a system, ICE has a system, FBI has a system, NCTC has a system, and that if you want to research information about certain individuals, you have to go into one system with a separate password. If you want to go into another system, you have to come out, maybe go to a different location, enter in with a new password in a different system, and do this over and over to make sure that you've got the redundancy necessary to find out all the information, whether it's a visa screening or whether it's an act of terror or an individual that's suspected. So we need to work. And I think, Senator Lieberman, this was partly why DHS was set up, so that it would be the hub and the wheel to share all that information so that we wouldn't have the mistakes made that we saw leading up to Boston that we're starting to discover now. So I think this hearing is very timely to raise that awareness within the eyes of the American people that DHS is the hub and the wheel. We spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to do this, and I don't believe it's been effective as seen by Boston. So thank you for y'all's service, Commissioner. God bless you. And God bless all the first responders. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Let me thank the witnesses for their patience. We stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair. We'll reconvene 10 minutes after the conclusion of the votes, about 11:35. Thank you.